Okay, thanks very much. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the findings from our ESRC project, Beyond Contagion, Social Identity Processes in Involuntary Social Influence. Now, one strand of this project concerned the spread of rioting in the 2011 riots in August in England in 2011. And as such, we're interested in the way that urban riots spread across locations and indeed other kinds of behaviours spread across people, across time and across space. And in the 2011 riots, you might remember that the initial rioting took place in Tottenham and spread around the Tottenham area on the first day. The next day, the rioting spread to other areas of London. So you can see Enfield, which is North London, Islington, Walton Cross, Oxford Street, Brixton, Chingford Mount, Walthamstow. That was the weekend. On the Monday, the riots continued to spread across other parts of the capital. So you can see there Hackney, Peckham, Lewisham, Catford, Clapham, Ealing, Pimlico, Notting Hill, Sloane Square, Acton, Woolwich, Camden, Colliers Wood, Wandsworth, Chingford Mount, Waltham Forest, Stratford, East Ham, Romford. But they also spread to other parts of the country. And on Tuesday, they declined in London, but they also spread to other areas of the country again. So you get that pattern of spread. I'm speaking in the theme of sustainable cities, in the overall theme of the good city, and I suppose the way to see the relevance of this work to that theme is to say, well, who's good city? Good city for who? Because many of the people involved in these riots didn't really identify with their city or with the places that they were rioting in. So I'm not sure, on what basis we could talk about their sustainability. Although there's a sub-theme as well for this theme, which is social stability or instability. So this research is basically psychology, along with other social sciences. There's a bit of sociology involved. It's not really urban studies, but I suppose it is urban studies in the sense that we've come to urban studies as a kind of outcome. It wasn't our premise. But in doing this work, these findings have come to be relevant for urban studies. In a piece of work complementary to ours a couple of years ago, Matteo Tiratelli, he did an analysis of the London riots, looking at the distribution of activities in certain districts in London. And he argued that to understand the patterns of spread within London and the choice of targets, we need to examine and understand participants' relationship with public spaces. So he said what's going on is that participants are attempting to take control of spaces in which they normally feel disempowered, so there's a kind of reversal of power relations. And this analysis is very similar to what we are finding, and so our work is kind of confirming and extending that kind of analysis about the control of space over time as a partial explanation for the riots in London and across the country. And the first question, when we talk about the riots, and sometimes there's a kind of assumption or presumption about what people were actually doing, and then that presumption forms the basis of explanations or pseudo-explanations. So I think the first thing is to say, well, what kinds of behaviours, what kinds of activities characterise the riots? And in fact, the term, I think E.P. Thompson once said this, that the term riot is unhelpful in a sense, that it disguises, or it conceals rather a lot. Because once one looks closely at urban riots, one finds different kinds of activity predominating at different times in different places. And we put together a sort of rough typology of the types of rioting that were evident in the 2011 events. So the first thing to say is, and in contrast, by the way, one of the dominant explanations that has been put out by sociologists, critical sociologists, is that these were essentially and only commodity riots or consumer riots by people who were duped by neoliberal ideology and just wanted trainers. Well, although there is an element of people wanting trainers and wanting other commodities, we identified 3 different types of riots with different patterns of behaviour. And the first riot that took place in Tottenham High Road was essentially a community riot or anti-police riot, which had the features of being triggered by a police action, being focused on the police, trying to remove the police from a particular district, to control that district against the police, and where we see attacks on targets being strategic, being focused on police-related targets. I mean, an obvious example in Tottenham, one of the first examples was the attack on the solicitors, which was seen as the solicitors sympathetic to the police. And many of the shops in Tottenham that were attacked, they were attacked for weapons to attack the police. And within Tottenham and other community riots, Hackney, Toxteth too, there was seen to be active and passive support from within the community. There's some very famous footage from the Tottenham riot. At one stage, you got all these people coming out into the streets, like from all these different cultures, including Hasidic Jews and all sorts, bringing food out to the rioters. So it really did seem to be this community riot. So that's one type of the typology. The other type, the most predominant type, was the commodity riot, the riot where people were not seeking out the police, but perhaps avoiding the police so they could go to areas and get high-end goods, often in an organised form. So it's a bit more premeditated, organised, and often involved travelling to certain kind of locations where people knew these goods were, and getting involved in selective looting. So we saw that in Tottenham Hale. So after Tottenham, the rioting spread to Tottenham Hale, Wood Green, also in North London, and other areas of the UK. And a third kind of riot, less common but also distinctive and worth mentioning because it doesn't quite fit the other two, is what we call the anti-rich or class riot. So this again involved travelling, people identifying an area, a targeted area, and the attacks on property were less discriminating within the area because it seemed as if people attacked everything in an area that they perceived as privileged or rich. And you see, like, every car, every shop window is just trashed in an attempt to damage the other class. And we saw that at Ealing, saw that in Croydon, saw that in Sloane Square and other areas. So that's the first question. So what phenomenon are we talking about? And our point is there are different kinds of phenomenon under the term riot. And the second question, the kind of core question for us really, is this question of spread. So the initial spread was within the Haringey area. It was from Tottenham High Road to Tottenham Hale and then Wood Green. And we've analysed this in terms of a change in norms and targets, as well as this spread to other neighbourhoods. Because Tottenham Green, as I've indicated in the previous slide, Tottenham High Road was a community riot, an attack on the police. But when it spread to Wood Green and Tottenham Hale, it was much more about commodities and avoiding the police. So there was a change over time, as well as a change over space. And we have put together extremely large data set of different sources to understand what's going on. And we had privileged access to the Guardian LSE Reading the Riots interview corpus, which is a body of 270 interviews with rioters. So you've got accounts. We've also analysed all the video evidence, and there's dozens and dozens of video accounts. We've got the police data, we've got news accounts, we've got a very large data set to unpack what was going on as the riot spread. And one of the things that came across in the spread from Tottenham to Wood Green and Tottenham Hale, and I think explains the transformation, is what you might call a postcode truce, right? So if you don't know anything about urban youth, they, particularly in London, their relations with each other are shaped by postcode rivalries. So a youth going into another youth's area will feel that they might get stabbed, okay? So within the riot in Tottenham, this was transcended because they saw themselves as having a common relationship to the police. So that in turn created new possibilities, because now they are a more powerful group. They're a more powerful group, which means they are able to take on the police. And then they were able to take on the police, and then other possibilities too began to arise. So this just tracks some of the movement of the rioters up Tottenham High Road, then away from Tottenham into Tottenham Hale and Wood Green. So over time and over space, these postcode rivalries were superseded by a common anti-police identity that made other things possible. So not only fighting the police, but other desires and other grievances could be expressed. So this is an example of a quote from somebody, and it illustrates some of the process, because once the crowd was empowered, that empowerment was a kind of intergroup relationship. Okay, so certain kinds of activities by the police were interpreted by the crowd as indicative of police inability to act or weakness. So it wasn't just that people were united, they also perceived the police as disempowered. So it was a quite well-known episode near the start of the riots when the police had a police car kind of stranded in Tottenham High Road, and somebody set it alight, and the police didn't go to rescue it, they just left it to burn. And so somebody says, well, a car set on fire in the middle of Tottenham High Road and left to burn for a while. Now to me, I'm thinking, wait a minute, now you're saying there's no law and order in this area, because that's a police car and nothing's happening. You're now saying this is a lawless place. So they're interpreting that as indicative of the weakness of the police in that context. And so this and other evidence of the police inability to manage or control the crowd led to a reversal in the normal power relations, because normally, I mean, these are people that are often talking about a history of stop and search where they're routinely humiliated on the streets, but for now, they are in control of the streets. So we had them under control, we had them under manners for once. They never had us under manner, we had them on the lock, on smash, running away from us. We weren't running away from the police, they were the criminals today. We were enforcing the law, getting them out of our town because they aren't doing nothing good for no one. So there's a kind of positive feedback loop whereby they would take action, so they would attack a shop, and on the basis of feeling more empowered, then the police would be seen to be unable to do anything about that, and that reinforced the empowerment which made other possibilities come into view. And so then moving on to geographical spread across North London. So in our second analysis, we went beyond the Haringey area to understand how rioting spread to Enfield the next day. And you can see on the map, Enfield is north of London, so and we discovered that a lot of the spread was of people travelling, people who were empowered the day before, feeling able to go to Enfield and target the high street, but also target the police. And in fact, there's an interesting interaction or interrelation between the attacks on property and attacks on police, because there were some examples of attacks on property which were initiated in order to draw the police in and draw them into conflict. Something to say structurally about Enfield is that it is, compared to where many of the rioters come from, a better off area, and this map kind of illustrates that. So you've got this kind of structural explanation of deprivation and so on as part of the explanation, but there are also dynamics that are lost if you simply say, oh, it's just deprivation. It's more than that. There were processes going on, such as actions by the police, which they thought they hoped were going to prevent or quell the rioting, which actually backfired. And one example here was, so the police had intelligence that rioting was going to happen in Enfield. So they went into Enfield town centre, and they advised the shopkeepers to close the shops. Right? But once the shops had started closing, then potential rioters, then for them that was a signal that the riot was going to take place in Enfield town centre. So then they mobilised to Enfield, and rioting took place. So that was our second analysis, the spread into another location in North London. And as I said, a lot of that seemed to be people who were from Tottenham empowered in going to another district, so people travelling. However, our third analysis is focusing on South London, which 10 minutes, okay, 1 minute, okay. It's focusing on South London over the following days, and here, prima facie, it appeared that people weren't travelling, things were happening too fast for people to travel, so you've got a riot which seemed to be an effect of the previous riot. Now this tallies with what sociologists have been saying for a number of years. When they first started looking at the urban riots in the 1960s, they realised that they occurred in waves, and that the bigger the riot, or the more intense the riot in one location, the more likely it would be that there will be riots in other locations. So this is prima facie what we seem to be having here, but these previous sociological studies hadn't really understood process, the psychology, if you like, which is what we are trying to do here. So we've been looking at the spread into Brixton, Clapham and Croydon. And here, the empowerment process is, I suppose the common sense term would be vicarious for this. You get empowered by other people's action, not your own action, your own group's action in the moment where you act against the police and they're unable to respond, but your sense of identification with others distally who are taking these actions, your sense that they are us, we are all anti-police, and you get confidence and empowerment from that process. And so we're finding people being told through their networks that this Tottenham was going on, and feeling that we could do this because we are the same people as the people in Tottenham. So that empowerment process is transferring across time and space through identification. So I haven't got time to say much more about that, but I will say what we're arguing against, which is this idea. So there is a pseudo explanation for this, and in the literature it's called contagion, and in the newspapers it's called copycat, which kind of renders these processes to be mindless, irrational, and so on. I think what we're trying to do is say, well, yeah, there is a kind of a learning or an influence process, but it's not mindless, because one, it's based on identity, which creates limits. So not everybody who heard about the riots was empowered to act in the same way. You have to identify with the group who are empowered to feel empowered. So it's not mindless, it's not indiscriminate. And as I said earlier, there were different kinds of riots anyway. So it's not as if people are simply copying behaviours. They're learning at a kind of higher order level. So I kind of need to finish. I'm not going to go through these slides. So the last thing I want to say is, so many of the immediate commentators said what happened when people trashed certain shops in local areas. This was a form of community self-destruction, they said, and this was used to imply that this was a mindless process. But what that overlooks is, or what that assumes, is that these people involved in that identified with those local areas, that it is a part of self, an extension of self. Well, we don't think it is. We think when people are trashing these places, well, there's one thing is they're doing it strategically to bring the police in, but secondly, they're doing it because they simply don't identify with those places, and so it doesn't feel like self-destruction to them. And so in conclusion then, I think one of the ways we can understand not only how the events happen, but how they spread, is through using these concepts of control over spaces. The pattern of behaviour does fit with the hypothesis whereby people were trying to overturn their normal relations where they don't feel in control, they feel controlled by others who are alien to them. So this does, I think, try to address the question of a good city for who. How far it addresses the sustainability thing, I'll leave you to discuss.